She was disrespected because of her color. But what happened next defies all expectations. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Sarah Bennett walked with determined strides down Peachtree Street, her leather briefcase rhythmically tapping against her leg with each step. At 32, Sarah was a vision of determination and elegance, her navy blue suit contrasting beautifully with her dark, radiant skin. A graduate with honors from Emory Law School, Sarah quickly established herself as one of Atlanta's most promising attorneys. Specializing in civil rights, she had built a reputation as a fierce and tireless advocate for justice, particularly for the city's marginalized communities. That afternoon, Sarah was on her way to meet a potential new client, a case that promised to be as challenging as it was important. As she walked, her mind wandered to the events that had led her here, a journey marked by obstacles, determination, and an unyielding desire to make a difference. Sarah had grown up in a modest neighborhood in southern Atlanta, the only child of hard-working parents who had sacrificed everything to give her a quality education. From a young age, she had learned about the injustices of the world, not only through the stories her parents told, but also through her own experiences. At 12 years old, Sarah witnessed the unjust arrest of her uncle, accused of a crime he did not commit simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and for being black. The image of her uncle being led away in handcuffs, protesting his innocence while the neighbors watched helplessly, remained etched in her memory. It was at that moment that Sarah decided she would become a lawyer, vowing to herself that she would fight so that no one else would have to endure what her family had gone through. The years that followed were filled with intense study and unwavering determination. Sarah excelled in school, earning a scholarship to the University of Georgia, where she graduated with top honors before being accepted to the prestigious Emory Law School. Now, nearly a decade after graduation, Sarah had become a force to be reckoned with in Atlanta's legal world. Her reputation preceded her. A brilliant lawyer, relentless in her pursuit of justice, and a thorn in the side of the legal establishment that had long ignored the systemic injustices that permeated the system. As she approached the building where the meeting would take place, Sarah felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. It was a message from her assistant, Lily. "Client has arrived. Seems nervous." "Good luck." Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and entered the building. The air conditioning hit her like a refreshing wave, a welcome contrast to the stifling heat outside. She greeted the security guard with a warm smile, something she made a point of doing, knowing from experience how often people in service positions were treated as invisible. In the elevator, Sarah took the moment to mentally review the details of the case she was about to take on. Marcus Johnson, a 24-year-old African-American man, had been brutally beaten by 2 police officers during a routine stop. The incident, captured on video by a bystander, had caused outrage in the community, but the police department seemed determined to cover it up. The elevator doors opened on the 12th floor, and Sarah walked down the hall to her office. Lily, a young woman of Asian descent with purple hair and a welcoming smile, stood up to greet her. "Mr. Johnson is in the conference room," Lily informed her, handing Sarah a folder with the preliminary case documents. "I offered him coffee, but he declined. He seems pretty shaken." Sarah nodded, thanking Lily before heading to the conference room. She knew the next few moments would be crucial. Gaining Marcus's trust would be essential for the success of the case. As she entered the room, Sarah immediately sensed the tension in the air. Marcus Johnson sat rigidly in one of the leather chairs, his eyes nervously darting to the door as she walked in. He was young, with features marked by recent stress, wearing a carefully pressed dress shirt that seemed slightly too large for his slender frame. "Mr. Johnson," Sarah said with a warm smile, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Bennett. It's a pleasure to meet you." Marcus hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand. His grip was firm. but Sarah could feel a slight tremor in his fingers. "Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Bennett," he responded, his voice low and cautious. "Please, call me Sarah," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Before we begin, I want you to know that everything we discuss here is strictly confidential. This is a safe space, Mr. Johnson. I'm here to listen to you and to fight for you." Marcus nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing almost imperceptibly. Sarah gave him a moment, knowing from experience that silence was often as important as words. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this," Marcus finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've always been a law-abiding citizen, you know? Never had any trouble with the police before. And now I can't sleep at night. I have nightmares. I keep looking over my shoulder every time I leave the house." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "What happened to you was terrible and unjust, Mr. Johnson, and I want you to know that you're not alone in this fight. Could you tell me, in your own words, what happened that night?" Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, there was a mix of pain and determination in his gaze. "It was a Friday night," he began. "I had just gotten off work. I'm an administrative assistant at a medical clinic. I was walking to the subway station, like I do every day. That's when I saw the patrol car approaching." Sarah listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, but mainly keeping eye contact with Marcus, silently encouraging him to continue. "At first, I didn't think much of it, but then they stopped next to me and 2 officers got out. One of them, the taller one, came straight at me, asking what I was doing there. I explained that I was heading home from work, but he didn't seem to be listening. He started asking me more questions, his tone getting more aggressive." Marcus paused, swallowing hard. Sarah offered him a glass of water, which he accepted with a grateful nod. Before I knew it, they were pushing me against the wall. I tried to protest, saying I hadn't done anything wrong, but that only seemed to make them angrier. The shorter officer twisted my arm behind my back so hard I thought it was going to break. And then the beating started. Marcus's voice faltered, and Sarah saw tears forming in his eyes. She waited patiently, giving him the time he needed to compose himself. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like forever. They kicked me, punched me, yelling things I could barely understand. All I could do was try to protect myself, pray for it to stop. And then, suddenly, it did. I heard a voice shouting, someone saying they were filming everything. The officers backed off, and I collapsed to the ground. Sarah felt a wave of anger surge through her, but she kept her expression professional and compassionate. "Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry you went through that. What happened to you was a blatant abuse of power and a violation of your civil rights. I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to ensure justice is served." Marcus looked at her, a mixture of hope and skepticism in his eyes. "Do you really think we can win? I mean, it's my word against theirs. And they're cops." Sarah leaned forward, her voice firm and confident. "Mr. Johnson, we have more than just your word. We have the video recorded by the bystander. We have your medical records documenting the injuries, and I'm confident we'll find other evidence as we dig deeper. Plus, we're not alone in this fight. Cases like yours are gaining more and more national attention, and there's a growing demand for police accountability." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "It won't be easy. The police department will likely fight tooth and nail to protect their officers. They have resources, influence, and a long history of getting away with situations like this. But we have the truth on our side, Mr. Johnson. And I firmly believe that if we fight with everything we have, we can win." Marcus nodded slowly, a spark of determination beginning to shine in his eyes. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah opened her briefcase, pulling out some documents. "First, we need to file a formal complaint against the officers involved and the police department. We're also going to file a civil lawsuit for damages. In the meantime, my team and I will start digging deep. We'll look for patterns of similar behavior by these officers, review their disciplinary records if there are any, and try to locate other witnesses from the night of the incident." She looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "I need you to be prepared, Mr. Johnson. This won't be easy. The defense will likely try to discredit you, dig into your past for anything they can use against you. They might even try to intimidate you into backing down. But I want you to know that I'll be by your side every step of the way. We're in this together." Marcus took a deep breath, then squared his shoulders. "I understand, and I'm ready. I can't let them get away with this. Not just for me, but for everyone else who might go through the same thing." Sarah smiled, feeling a mix of pride and determination. "That's exactly the attitude we need, Mr. Johnson. Together, we're going to fight not just for your case, but for real change in the system." They spent the next hour discussing the details of the case, with Sarah explaining each step of the legal process that lay ahead. When Marcus finally left the office, there was a new confidence in his step, a determination that hadn't been there when he arrived. Sarah stood in her office doorway for a moment, watching Marcus step into the elevator. She knew the road ahead would be tough, but she also knew that cases like this were exactly why she had become a lawyer. Returning to her desk, Sarah immediately got to work. She called her team of investigators, giving them instructions to start digging deep into the history of the officers involved. Then, she began drafting the formal complaint, her hands flying over the keyboard as she put into precise legal language the injustice Marcus had suffered. The hours passed quickly, the sun setting over Atlanta as Sarah continued working. She barely noticed when Lily entered her office, placing a steaming cup of coffee on her desk. You should go home, Sarah," Lily said gently. "It's after 9. Sarah looked up, surprised. She hadn't realized how much time had passed. "Just a few more minutes," she promised. "I want to finish this draft." Lily nodded, knowing her boss well enough to realize that a few minutes probably meant at least another hour. "All right, but don't stay too late. You've got that radio interview tomorrow morning, remember?" Sarah groaned inwardly. She had nearly forgotten about the interview, part of her ongoing efforts to raise awareness about racial justice issues and police reform. "Thanks for the reminder, Lily. I promise I won't be much longer." After Lily left, Sarah returned to her work, but her mind started to wander to the next day's interview. She knew it would be an important opportunity to draw attention to cases like Marcus's, to push for real change in the system. But she also knew that her words would be closely scrutinized, potentially used against her and her clients if she wasn't careful. Finally, around 10:30, Sarah saved her work and shut down her computer. As she tidied her desk, her eyes fell on a framed photo, her and her parents on the day of her law school graduation. She smiled as she remembered the pride in their eyes that day, the certainty they had that she would make a difference in the world. "I'm trying, Dad," she murmured to the image of her father, who had passed away 2 years ago. "I'm really trying." The drive home was quiet, Atlanta's streets much less busy than during the day. Sarah drove on autopilot, her mind still on Marcus's case and the interview the next day. She barely noticed when she arrived at her apartment, a modest but comfortable space in the Inman Park neighborhood. Stepping into her apartment, Sarah was greeted by silence. She flipped on the lights, revealing a tidy living room with clear signs of a busy life, stacks of law books on the coffee table, a coat draped over the back of the sofa, a half-finished cup of coffee forgotten on the kitchen counter. She set her briefcase down on the floor near the door and walked to the kitchen, opening the fridge only to find it nearly empty. With a sigh, she closed the door and opted for a glass of red wine she had opened the night before. As she sipped her wine, Sarah turned on the TV, tuning into the local news. It didn't take long for a story about police brutality to come on. It was a different case from Marcus's, but painfully similar. Another young black man unjustly attacked by those who were supposed to protect him. Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Sometimes it seemed like for every case she won, 10 new ones emerged. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. But then she remembered the look in Marcus's eyes when he left her office today, that mix of hope and determination. It was for people like him that she kept fighting. Turning off the TV, Sarah headed to her small home office. The walls were covered in diplomas, certificates, and photos, reminders of cases won and lives changed. Her eyes landed on one photo in particular, taken a few years ago. In it, Sarah stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by a black family, all of them smiling broadly. It had been her first major civil rights case, a hard-fought battle against housing discrimination that she had won against all odds. Sarah smiled at the memory, feeling her determination renew. She grabbed a notepad and started jotting down points for her radio interview the next day. She wanted to be prepared, ready to articulate not just the horrors of police brutality, but also the solutions, better training for officers, increased accountability, changes to use of force policies. As she worked, Sarah heard her phone vibrate. It was a text message from her mother. "Saw you on the news today, talking about the new case. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Your father would be too." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Her mother's unwavering support always touched her. She quickly replied, promising to call the next day after the radio interview. It was after midnight when Sarah finally went to bed. Lying in the dark, she mentally reviewed the day's events, the meeting with Marcus, the work on the formal complaint, the preparations for the interview. Tomorrow would be another day of battle, but she was ready for it. When her alarm went off at 5:30 the next morning, Sarah was already awake. She never slept well on the eve of big events, and this radio interview was no exception. She got up, dressed in her running clothes, and headed out for her usual morning jog. The streets of Atlanta were quiet at this hour, the air cool and the sky just beginning to lighten with the first rays of the sun. Sarah ran at a steady pace, her mind focused. Running always helped her organize her thoughts, prepare for the challenges of the day. Back at the apartment, she took a quick shower and dressed carefully. A navy blue suit that she knew made her look professional and confident, even though the radio listeners wouldn't be able to see her. She paused in front of the mirror, adjusting her hair and applying light makeup. "You can do this, Sarah," she told her reflection. "You were born for this." On her way to the radio station, Sarah received a message from Lily. "Good luck with the interview. I'll be listening." Oh, and the police department called. They want to schedule a meeting to discuss the Johnson case. Sarah frowned. That was faster than she expected. Usually, the department took days, sometimes weeks, to respond to formal complaints. The fact that they were seeking a meeting so quickly could mean they were worried about the negative publicity, or that they were gearing up to fight with full force. Arriving at the radio station, Sarah was greeted by an enthusiastic producer who led her into the studio. The host, a middle-aged man named Frank Holloway, sat behind a large microphone, headphones in place. "Sarah Bennett," Frank exclaimed, standing up to greet her. "It's a pleasure to have you back on our show. Ready to shake things up this morning?" Sarah smiled, shaking his hand. "Always ready, Frank. Thanks for having me again." As she settled into her chair and put on the headphones, Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself. She knew that her words today could make a difference not just for Marcus's case, but for the larger fight against police brutality and systemic racism. "They were on the air in 5, 4, 3. The producer counted down quietly, and then the red light blinked on. "Good morning, Atlanta." Frank's cheerful voice filled the studio. This is Frank Holloway, and you're tuned in to Atlanta Morning. Today, we have a very special guest with us, the renowned civil rights attorney, Sarah Bennett. Sarah, welcome to the show. Thanks for having me, Frank, Sarah replied, her voice calm and confident. Sarah, you've recently taken on a high-profile case involving allegations of police brutality against a young African-American man. Can you tell us a bit about that? Sarah leaned into the microphone. Of course, Frank. While I can't go into too many specific details due to the sensitive nature of the case, I can say that this is yet another disturbing example of a pattern we see all too often: the excessive use of force by police officers, particularly against people of color. And what would you say to those who argue that these incidents are just a few bad apples and not indicative of a larger problem? I'd say we need to look beyond individual incidents and examine the system as a whole, Sarah Ree. When we see the same type of incident happening repeatedly in cities across the country, we can no longer talk about bad apples. We're dealing with a systemic problem that requires systemic changes. The interview continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah skillfully navigating tough questions and articulating the need for comprehensive reforms. She spoke about the importance of better training for officers, increased accountability, and the need to address institutional racism not just in law enforcement, but in all aspects of society. When the red light finally went off, Frank took off his headphones with a low whistle. Wow, Sarah, you really don't pull any punches, do you? Sarah smiled, feeling the adrenaline of the interview beginning to wear off. I can't afford to pull punches, Frank. There are lives at stake. Leaving the radio station, Sarah checked her phone. There were several messages, one from her mother, congratulating her on the interview, a few from fellow attorneys expressing support, and one from Lily informing her that the meeting with the police department had been scheduled for that afternoon. Sarah sighed. It was going to be a long day. Back at the office, Sarah barely had time to grab a cup of coffee before diving into a series of meetings and phone calls. Marcus's case was gaining momentum quickly, and she wanted to make sure they were prepared for anything the police department might throw at them. At 2 p.m, Sarah sat in a conference room at the Atlanta Police Department, Marcus by her side. Across the table sat Police Chief Robert Hawkins, a burly man with graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and the department's attorney, a wiry, nervous-looking man named Alan Prescott. Miss Bennett, Mr. Johnson, Chief Hawkins began, his voice deep and controlled. We appreciate you coming to meet with us today. We hope we can resolve this situation amicably. Sarah kept her expression neutral. Chief Hawkins, we're here to hear what the department has to say about the incident involving Mr. Johnson. But let me be clear. What happened to my client was a flagrant violation of his rights, and we're prepared to take this case as far as it needs to go if necessary. Chief Hawkins frowned, but it was Prescott who spoke. Ms. Bennett, we understand that Mr. Johnson went through a distressing experience. However, our preliminary investigations indicate that the officers in question acted within established protocols. Sarah felt Marcus stiffen beside her. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm before responding. Mr. Prescott, with all due respect, if beating an unarmed man who was not resisting is within established protocols, then those protocols need to be drastically revised. You're exaggerating the situation, Ms. Bennett. Chief Hawkins intervened. Our officers are trained to use the necessary force to ensure their own safety and that of the community. Necessary force? Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice trembling with emotion. I was walking home from work. I didn't resist. How is beating me to the point where I could barely walk considered necessary force? A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah could see the discomfort in Prescott's eyes, but Chief Hawkins remained impassive. Mr. Johnson, Hawkins said finally, I'm sorry that you felt mistreated, but you have to understand that our officers often have to make tough decisions in fractions of a second. Sarah felt her anger rising, but she kept her voice calm and professional. "Chief Hawkins, we have a video of the incident. There were no tough decisions to be made. What we see is a clear and unjustified abuse of power." Prescott cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we can reach a settlement. The department is willing to offer financial compensation to Mr. Johnson in exchange for a confidentiality agreement and the withdrawal of all charges." Sarah exchanged a look with Marcus before responding. "I'm sorry, but that's not acceptable. We're not just seeking compensation for Mr. Johnson, although he certainly deserves it. We're seeking real and lasting changes in the way the department operates." Chief Hawkins leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Ms. Bennett, you must understand that taking this further could have serious consequences, not just for the officers involved, but for the department as a whole. This could impair our ability to keep the city safe." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, Chief, it's precisely that kind of mentality that perpetuates the problem. True community safety comes when all citizens can trust that they will be treated fairly and with respect by the police, regardless of the color of their skin." The meeting continued for another hour, with both sides presenting their arguments. In the end, it was clear there would be no easy resolution. As Sarah and Marcus left the building, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets of Atlanta. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice tired but determined. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Now, we prepare for battle. They're not going to make it easy for us, Marcus. But I promise you, we're going to fight with everything we've got." As they walked to Sarah's car, she couldn't help but think about how many times she had been in this position before, facing a system that seemed determined to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. But each case, each client like Marcus, only strengthened her resolve. Back at the office, Sarah found her team waiting for her. Lily, 2 other associate attorneys, and the lead investigator were gathered in the conference room, surrounded by stacks of documents and open laptops. "How did it go?" Lily asked as soon as Sarah walked into the room. Sarah sighed, sinking into a chair. "As expected, they tried to buy us off with a confidentiality agreement. When we refused, they moved on to veiled threats." Tom, the investigator, leaned forward. "I've got some information that might help us. I managed to locate 3 other people who had similar encounters with the same officers in the past 18 months. 2 of them are willing to testify." Sarah felt a surge of hope. "Excellent work, Tom. This might be exactly what we need to establish a pattern of behavior." The team spent the next few hours discussing strategies, reviewing evidence, and preparing for what they all knew would be a grueling legal battle. It was nearly midnight when Sarah finally sent everyone home. Alone in her office, Sarah allowed herself a moment of doubt. She knew the road ahead would be tough. The police department had resources, political influence, and a long history of protecting its own. But then she remembered the look in Marcus's eyes, the mix of pain, fear, and hope. She remembered all the other clients who had put their trust in her over the years, all the injustices she had witnessed. With a determined sigh, Sarah returned to her work. She knew the next few weeks would be critical for the case. In the weeks that followed, Marcus Johnson's case became the center of Sarah's life. She worked tirelessly, often sleeping in her office, buried in legal precedents and litigation strategies. Her team was equally committed, each of them feeling the weight of the responsibility they carried. News of the case spread quickly through the community. Sarah began receiving calls from other victims of police brutality, all eager to share their stories. Each new account only solidified her determination to see the case through to the end. Meanwhile, the Atlanta Police Department didn't sit idly by. They launched an aggressive public relations campaign, painting the officers involved as dedicated heroes who were simply doing their jobs in a difficult situation. The local media was divided, with some outlets supporting the police's version of events, while others questioned the official narrative. Sarah knew the battle wouldn't just be fought in the courtroom, but also in the court of public opinion. She began making more media appearances, carefully articulating the facts of the case and the need for police reform. Her eloquence and passion resonated with many, and soon she found herself at the center of a growing movement for change. A month after the initial meeting with the police department, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was Lisa Tanner, an investigative reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "Ms. Bennett," Lisa began, her voice low and urgent, "I have information that could be crucial to your case. Can we meet in person?" Sarah agreed, and 2 hours later, she was sitting in a discreet downtown cafe with Lisa across from her. The reporter looked nervous, her eyes constantly scanning the room. "What do you have for me, Lisa?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low. Lisa slid a brown envelope across the table. Internal documents from the police department. They show that the officers involved in the Johnson case have a history of excessive force complaints. More importantly, they show that the department knew about it and chose not to take action. Sarah felt her heart race as she opened the envelope and scanned the documents. It was a gold mine of information, exactly the kind of evidence that could turn the case in her favor. "How did you get this?" Sarah asked, looking at Lisa with a mix of gratitude and concern. The reporter shrugged, a tense smile on her lips. "I have my sources, but Sarah, you need to be careful. There are powerful people who don't want this information to come out." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Thank you, Lisa. This could make all the difference." Back at the office, Sarah gathered her team to review the new documents. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. They knew they had something big, but they were also aware of the risks involved. "This changes everything," Tom, the investigator, said as he flipped through the papers. "With this, we can prove not only that the officers have a history of misconduct, but that the department actively covered it up." Sarah agreed. "But we need to be careful. The department is going to fight tooth and nail to discredit this evidence. We need to verify everything, twice, 3 times if necessary." In the weeks that followed, the team worked tirelessly to build their case. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed body camera footage, and dug deep into the department's records. Sarah knew they were building something solid, but she also felt the pressure mounting. The police department, sensing they were losing ground, ramped up their efforts to discredit Marcus and Sarah. Rumors began circulating in the media about Marcus's past, insinuations that he had a criminal record, which was false. Sarah also found herself the target of attacks, with critics questioning her motives and accusing her of being anti-police. One night, as Sarah worked late in her office, she received a disturbing call. It was Marcus, his voice shaking with fear. "Sarah, there's a police car parked outside my house. They've been there for hours. I think they're trying to intimidate me." Sarah felt a wave of anger and concern. "Marcus, listen to me. Don't leave the house. I'm going to call a friend of mine at the sheriff's department. We'll get this sorted out." After ensuring Marcus would be safe, Sarah collapsed into her chair, the reality of the situation weighing heavily on her. This was no longer just a legal case. It was a battle for the very soul of the justice system. The next morning, Sarah called a press conference. Standing before a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing, she made a powerful statement. "What is happening here is more than just a case of police brutality. It's a test of our justice system. It's a question of whether we will allow those who are supposed to protect us to abuse their power with impunity. The intimidation of witnesses, the defamation of victims, the cover-up of misconduct. This has to stop. And it will stop, because we will not back down. We will not be silenced. We will fight for justice, no matter the cost." Her words echoed across the city, galvanizing public support. Peaceful demonstrations began to spring up, with citizens demanding police reform and greater accountability. As the trial approached, the tension in the city was palpable. Sarah knew the outcome of this case could have ramifications far beyond Atlanta. It was an opportunity to set a precedent, to send a clear message that police brutality and systemic racism would no longer be tolerated. On the eve of the trial, Sarah was in her office, reviewing her final notes. She heard a soft knock on the door and looked up to see her mother, Eleanor, standing in the doorway. "I thought you might need this," Eleanor said, walking in with a takeout bag from Sarah's favorite restaurant. Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thanks, Mom. I really did need this." Eleanor sat down, watching her daughter with a mix of pride and concern. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Sarah took a deep breath. "As ready as I can be. It's going to be tough, Mom. They're going to throw everything they have at us." Eleanor took Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, honey, but you're strong. You always have been. Your father would be so proud of you right now." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes at the thought of her father. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, if it's worth all this stress, all this risk." "Of course, it's worth it," Eleanor said firmly. "You're fighting for something bigger than yourself. You're giving a voice to those who've been silenced for too long. That's exactly what your father and I raised you to do." Sarah hugged her mother, feeling strengthened by her unwavering support. When Eleanor left, Sarah returned to her work with renewed determination. Tomorrow would be the day when everything she had fought for would be put to the test. On the morning of the trial, Sarah woke up before dawn. She dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit that made her feel confident and powerful. As she pinned her hair back in a tight bun, she looked at herself in the mirror, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. "You can do this," she told her reflection. "You were born for this." Arriving at the courthouse, Sarah was greeted by a crowd of reporters and protesters. She saw signs demanding justice for Marcus, others defending the police. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. Inside the courtroom, Sarah found Marcus waiting for her. He looked pale but determined. "Are we ready for this?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, looking him in the eyes. "We're more than ready, Marcus. No matter what happens today, know that you've already made a difference. You had the courage to stand up, to tell your story. That's more than many people ever do." When the judge entered and the court was called to order, Sarah felt a surprising calm wash over her. She knew the next few days would be an intense battle, but she also knew she was on the right side of history. As the trial unfolded, Sarah showed why she was considered one of Atlanta's best civil rights attorneys. She presented evidence meticulously, cross-examined witnesses with surgical precision, and made passionate arguments that left the gallery in silence. The pivotal moment came when Sarah called one of the officers involved in the incident to the stand. Under her skillful questioning, the officer began to contradict himself, his story unraveling under the weight of the evidence and Sarah's relentless logic. "Officer Davis," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm, "you claim that you only used the necessary force to subdue Mr. Johnson. Yet the video we've seen clearly shows Mr. Johnson on the ground, not resisting, while you and your partner continue to assault him. How do you explain that discrepancy?" Officer Davis hesitated, his nervous gaze darting between Sarah and the jury. I believed he still posed a threat." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "A threat? An unarmed man, lying on the ground, begging you to stop? What kind of threat could he possibly pose at that moment?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel the jury leaning forward, absorbing every word. Let me rephrase, Officer Davis, Sarah continued, her voice gaining intensity. Isn't it true that you and your partner have a history of using excessive force, particularly against black suspects? Isn't it true that the department was aware of this pattern of behavior and chose not to take action? Objection! The defense attorney shouted, jumping to his feet. The counsel is speculating. I'm not speculating, Your Honor, Sarah responded calmly, picking up a folder from her desk. I have here internal department documents that prove exactly what I'm saying. The judge, after reviewing the documents, allowed Sarah to continue. Officer Davis's face visibly paled. In the days that followed, Sarah continued to build her case meticulously. She called expert witnesses on police use of force, who testified that the officer's actions were clearly excessive. She presented statistics showing a pattern of unequal treatment of black suspects by the department. And most powerfully, she brought in other victims of the same officers to testify, each recounting stories painfully similar to Marcus's. The defense fought hard, trying to paint Marcus as a criminal and the officers as misunderstood heroes. But Sarah was prepared for every argument, every attempt to divert attention from the core issues of the case. On the final day of the trial, Sarah stood to deliver her closing argument. She looked at the jury, then at Marcus, and finally at the accused officers before beginning to speak. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice clear and resolute. Over the course of this trial, you've heard many things. You've heard about policies and procedures, about statistics and patterns of behavior. But at the heart of all this is a simple, undeniable truth. An innocent man was brutally assaulted by those who swore to protect and serve him. Sarah paused, letting her words sink in. Marcus Johnson is not a number in a statistic. He is a human being, a son, a brother, a valuable member of our community. On the night in question, he was doing nothing more than walking home after a long day at work. His only crime, in the eyes of Officers Davis and Thompson, was being a black man walking in a neighborhood where they thought he didn't belong. She walked slowly in front of the jury, making eye contact with each member. What happened to Marcus Johnson is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern, a pattern of abuse of power and racial prejudice that has stained our justice system for far too long. The documents we've presented, the testimonies you've heard, all point to one inescapable truth. This isn't just about two officers who lost control one night. It's about a system that has allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Sarah turned to look directly at the accused officers. Officers Davis and Thompson swore to protect and serve, but on that night, they did not protect Marcus Johnson. They did not serve our community. They betrayed the trust we placed in them, and in doing so, they not only harmed Marcus Johnson, but also tarnished the badge that so many good and honorable officers wear with pride. Turning back to the jury, Sarah concluded, Ladies and gentlemen, today you have the opportunity to send a message that in our community, justice sees no color, that those entrusted with upholding the law are not above it, that every life, black, white, or any other color, has value and deserves protection. I ask you to do the right thing. Find Officers Davis and Thompson guilty. Show the world that in Atlanta, justice still means something. With those words, Sarah returned to her seat beside Marcus. She could feel the tension in the room, see the thoughtful expressions on the jurors' faces. Now, all that was left was to wait. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. For Sarah and Marcus, they were the longest 48 hours of their lives. They waited in Sarah's office, surrounded by the legal team and friends and family who had come to offer support. Finally, on the afternoon of the second day, the news came. The jury had reached a verdict. Back in the courtroom, Sarah held Marcus's hand as they waited for the jury to enter. She could feel the tremble in his fingers, see the fear and hope warring in his eyes. Whatever happens, she whispered to him, know that you made a difference. You stood up, you fought, and no one can take that away from you." Marcus nodded, squeezing her hand in response. When the judge asked for the verdict, Sarah felt as if the entire world had stopped breathing. In the case of Johnson versus the City of Atlanta, on the charges against Officers Davis and Thompson, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause and cries of joy. Sarah felt Marcus collapse beside her, sobbing in relief. She hugged him tightly, her own tears beginning to fall. In the days that followed, the verdict dominated the headlines. It was hailed as a watershed moment in the fight against police brutality and systemic racism. The Atlanta Police Department announced a comprehensive review of its policies and practices. Local and state politicians began proposing legislation to increase police accountability. For Sarah, however, the most powerful moment came a few days after the verdict. She was in her office, reviewing some documents, when she heard a knock on the door. It was Marcus. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you, not just for the case, but for believing in me, for giving me a voice." Sarah smiled, feeling deeply touched. "You don't need to thank me, Marcus. You're the hero here. You had the courage to stand up, to tell your story. You inspired others to do the same." Marcus nodded, then hesitated for a moment before continuing. "You know, after what happened, I thought about leaving Atlanta. I didn't think there was a place for me here anymore. But now I want to stay. I want to be part of the change we're seeing." Sarah felt a surge of pride and hope. "I'm glad to hear that, Marcus. And if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." After Marcus left, Sarah sat for a long time, reflecting on everything that had happened. The case had been a significant victory, but she knew it was only the beginning. There was so much more work to be done. Picking up a pen, Sarah began jotting down notes for her next case. As she wrote, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready for the challenge. Because now, more than ever, she knew that change was possible, and she was determined to keep fighting, one case at a time, until justice was a reality for everyone. As the sun set over Atlanta, casting a golden glow through her office window, Sarah Bennett smiled. She knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, at least, she could rest knowing she had made a difference. And that, she thought, was all she ever wanted.